Jake Morrison floated in the command chair of the stealth ship Nightfall, watching the sensors paint a picture of empty space that wasn't really empty at all. 300 years had passed since the galaxy forgot about Earth, but Jake remembered everything. His great-grandmother had been there when the Coalition ships turned away from burning human worlds, leaving millions to die while alien politicians made their calculations about acceptable losses. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of advanced systems that no Coalition engineer would recognize. Lisa Chang bent over her navigation console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed hyperspace routes through regions the galaxy believed were dead zones. The Void War had left scars in space itself, but humans had learned to navigate those scars like old friends. Danny Rodriguez checked his weapon systems one more time, running diagnostics on particle cannons that could punch through Coalition shields like paper. His grandmother had died on New Boston when the Corvin Syndicate decided human lives weren't worth the fuel costs of evacuation ships. The weapon readings glowed green, ready to deliver justice that was 3 centuries overdue. Katie Walsh worked in the engine room, nursing fusion reactors that burned cleaner and hotter than anything the Coalition had developed. Her family came from the asteroid miners who had hidden in the belt when the Devourers came hunting. They had learned to survive on scraps and determination while the galaxy moved on without them. The mission briefing had been simple enough: intelligence. Networks across human space had intercepted Zephyrian communications about something called Project Reclamation. The Zephyrians, who had once called themselves humanity's closest allies, were planning to strip mine the Sol system for rare metals. They believed Earth was nothing but a dead rock floating in space, ready for industrial exploitation. Jake smiled at the thought. 12 billion humans still called the solar system home, living in cities carved deep into Luna's crust and massive orbital habitats that drifted invisible among the asteroid fields. The Zephyrians were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. Lisa looked up from her console, with data streaming across her neural interface. The Zephyrian mining fleet was exactly where human intelligence said it would be, gathering at the edge of Coalition space for the final jump to Sol. 3 massive industrial ships escorted by a dozen military vessels, all of them flying the banners of species that had once promised to stand beside humanity against any threat. The promises had lasted exactly as long as it took the Coalition Council to run the numbers on human worlds versus Zephyrian trade routes. When the Devourers came pouring out of dark space like a hungry tide, the Coalition had made their choice. They evacuated their own people first, then their important allies, then their trading partners. Humans had been dead last on the list, and by the time the evacuation ships arrived, there hadn't been any humans left to save, except there had been. Millions of them had gone underground or fled to hidden colonies in dead systems. They had watched their so-called allies divide up, human space like a prize, claiming worlds that still had human survivors hiding in deep shelters. The Coalition had rewritten history to make themselves look like heroes who had saved everyone they could. But humans remembered the truth. Danny's console chimed with a priority signal from Admiral Helen Carter back on Titan Command. The message was brief and encoded in a cipher that changed every few hours. The Zephyrian fleet would jump to Sol in 36 hours, and humanity's hidden observers were already in position. Operation Lazarus was moving to the next phase. Jake had served under Admiral Carter for 15 years. Ever since he graduated from the War College, hidden in the Kuiper Belt. She had been there during the dark years when human survivors debated whether to reveal themselves or stay hidden forever. The decision had been unanimous once the intelligence reports started coming in about Coalition, labor camps, and mining operations on former human worlds. The Coalition hadn't just abandoned humanity during the Void War. They had actively prevented human evacuation ships from reaching endangered colonies. They had sold intelligence about human settlements to the Devourers in exchange for safe passage through infected space. They had built their current prosperity on the graves of human worlds while telling themselves they were the heroes of the story. Katie's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room. The Nightfall's experimental drives were ready for the jump to Sol. Using technology that human engineers had developed during 3 centuries of hiding. Stealth systems that bent light around the ship's hull, fusion reactors that left no energy signature, weapons that fired coherent dark matter at near light speed. The galaxy had forgotten about human ingenuity along with everything else. They remembered humanity as a young species that needed protection and guidance from older, wiser civilizations. They had never imagined that abandonment might forge something harder and more dangerous than anything the Coalition had ever faced. Lisa plotted their course through hyperspace routes that didn't officially exist, paths between stars that human scouts had mapped during the long years of exile. The Coalition controlled the major trade routes and military corridors, but humanity had learned to travel through the spaces between spaces. The dark corners where forgotten species went to die. Jake thought about his daughter Emma, safe in the underground cities of Mars with her mother and grandmother. She was learning the same lessons that every human child learned now. Remember what they did. Remember who they left behind. Remember that promises made by aliens meant nothing when profit margins were at stake. The Nightfall slipped into hyperspace like a ghost entering a dream, heading toward humanity's birth world for a reunion that would reshape the galaxy. The Coalition had spent 300 years believing they were safe from the consequences of their choices. But consequences had a way of catching up eventually. In the depths of space, other human ships were moving toward their own targets. The liberation of New Boston was scheduled for next month, when the Corvin Syndicate least expected resistance from slaves they thought were broken. The infiltration of Alteron space was already underway, with deep cover agents preparing to expose decades of war crimes. Jake Morrison had been born in exile, but he was going home at last. Earth might have been forgotten by the galaxy, but Earth had never forgotten what the galaxy had done to humanity's children. The reckoning was about to begin. Alex Parker adjusted his breathing apparatus as the massive Zephyrian mining platform filled the viewport of their approach shuttle. The structure was ugly in the way that purely functional things often were, all angles and industrial components, designed to strip rare metals from asteroids and dead worlds. It hung in space like a metal parasite, ready to feed on the bones of humanity's birth world. Nina Brooks sat beside him, her fingers dancing across a portable hacking interface that looked like standard Coalition technology, but carried human improvements invisible to alien sensors. She had spent 5 years learning Zephyrian computer protocols, studying the weaknesses in systems that had grown complacent during 3 centuries of galactic dominance. Tony Garcia checked his demolition charges one more time. Small devices. That would look like routine maintenance equipment to casual inspection. Each charge contained enough focused energy to cripple a mining laser or collapse a support structure, but the real damage would be psychological. The Zephyrians needed to believe they were facing ghosts. Dr. Susan Lee reviewed the biological samples she would plant throughout the mining platform, evidence of human survival that would confuse Coalition scientists for years. Hair follicles with intact DNA, skin cells that carried markers unique to Earth's evolutionary history, blood samples that told a story of a species that refused to die quietly. Their shuttle docked with the mining platform's receiving bay without challenge. Alex's forged credentials identified him as a safety inspector from the Zephyrian Industrial Authority, complete with bureaucratic stamps and digital signatures that would pass any reasonable security check. The Coalition had grown lazy about verification procedures, trusting in databases that human hackers had been quietly editing for decades. The platform's corridors were filled with the sound of heavy machinery and the constant vibration of mining. Operations. Zephyrian workers moved through the passages with the casual arrogance of a species that believed they owned the galaxy by right of conquest. They spoke in their clicking language about quotas and profit margins, discussing the upcoming Sol operation like it was just another routine job. Alex listened to their conversations through his translation implant, learning details that human intelligence had missed. The mining operation would begin with a survey of Earth's moon, followed by asteroid harvesting and deep core extraction from the planet itself. The Zephyrians expected to find nothing more interesting than mineral deposits, and maybe some archaeological artifacts from the extinct. Human civilization. Nina accessed a maintenance terminal and began uploading her virus packages into the platforms. Computer network. The programs would remain dormant for weeks before activating, causing critical systems to fail at the worst possible moments. Mining lasers would misfire, navigation computers would develop mysterious glitches, and communication arrays would broadcast strange signals into empty space. The psychological warfare campaign had been Admiral Carter's idea, based on lessons learned during humanity's long exile. Direct military confrontation would come later, but first, the Coalition needed to be reminded that the galaxy was full of dangers they didn't understand. Fear was a weapon that could be deployed without risking human lives. Tony planted his charges in strategic locations throughout the platform, disguising them as routine maintenance equipment or safety devices. When they detonated, the explosions would disable key systems without killing workers. Human intelligence had strict rules about civilian casualties, even when those civilians worked for species that had abandoned humanity to die. Meanwhile, on the other side of Coalition space, Ryan Mitchell sat in a crowded cantina on the Alteron capital world, nursing a drink that tasted like synthetic alcohol and watching his target through the crowd. Minister Krelloff was discussing something important with a group of military advisors, their voices too low to hear over the background noise of alien music and conversation. Ryan had spent 5 years building his cover identity as a refugee from a minor species called the Hegemari, survivors of a world that the Alterans claimed to have evacuated before the Devourers arrived. The truth was darker and more profitable. The Alterans had sold the Hegemari homeworld to mining consortiums after relocating the population to labor camps disguised as refugee settlements. Maria Santos spoke into his earpiece from her position across the cantina, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. She had identified 2 of the military advisors as logistics coordinators for the Alteron slave operations, officers who managed the transportation of workers from one mining facility to another. Their conversation was being recorded by hidden sensors that would be analyzed later by human intelligence. The Alteron Republic had built its current prosperity on a foundation of slave labor extracted from species they claimed to protect. Refugee camps were actually selection centers where healthy individuals were separated from their families and shipped to industrial facilities throughout Alteron space. The weak and elderly were left to die in crowded settlements that barely provided subsistence-level resources. Ryan's handler had provided him with a list of facilities to investigate, starting with the mining operations on former human worlds. New Boston was the largest, where Corvin overseers managed thousands of human survivors who had been discovered in underground shelters 20 years after the official evacuation. The Corvins had declared them salvage and put them to work in rare metal extraction facilities. Nina finished uploading her virus packages and gave Alex a subtle hand signal that meant mission accomplished. The software would activate in precisely 30 days, causing cascading system failures throughout the mining platform's computer network. By then, the human infiltration team would be long gone, leaving behind only questions and growing paranoia. Dr. Susan Lee had completed her biological evidence planting, scattering human DNA samples in locations where they would be discovered during routine maintenance cycles. Coalition scientists would spend months trying to explain how human genetic material had appeared on a mining platform that had never visited Earth. The confusion would spread through their research networks like a virus of doubt. Alex led his team back to their shuttle, maintaining the role of a bored bureaucrat completing another routine inspection. The Zephyrian platform supervisor thanked him for his thoroughness and expressed hope that the safety certification would be processed quickly. Alex assured him that everything looked satisfactory and that the soul mining operation should proceed. On schedule, the shuttle departed without incident, carrying its human crew back to the deep space rendezvous point where the Nightfall waited in stealth mode. Jake Morrison received their report with quiet satisfaction, adding another successful infiltration to the growing list of operations that were preparing the galaxy for humanity's return. Tony Garcia had planted 17 charges throughout the mining platform, each one designed to fail critical systems without causing casualties. Nina Brooks had installed 43 virus packages that would activate at staggered intervals over the next several months. Dr. Susan Lee had scattered enough biological evidence to convince coalition scientists that humans were somehow still alive and active in their space. The psychological impact would be enormous. The coalition had spent 3 centuries believing they were safe from the consequences of their wartime decisions. But now strange accidents were happening throughout their space. Ships disappeared without explanation. Mining operations suffered. Mysterious failures, and computer networks began reporting impossible data about extinct species. Alex Parker looked back at the mining platform as their shuttle accelerated toward the jump point. In 30 days, those Zephyrians would discover that the galaxy was full of ghosts they thought they had buried 300 years ago. The realization would spread through coalition space like wildfire, preparing the ground for humanity's eventual return. The war wasn't beginning with battles or declarations. It was beginning with questions and doubt, with the slow erosion of certainty that had allowed the coalition to sleep peacefully since the end of the Void War. Humanity had learned patience during the long years of exile, and patience was about to become the coalition's worst nightmare. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the command deck of the battleship Resurrection, watching the tactical display show dozens of human ships dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Operation Lazarus had moved beyond infiltration and sabotage into open warfare, and the galaxy was about to discover that humanity had spent 3 centuries preparing for this moment. Jake Morrison commanded the lead squadron, his ship Nightfall now fitted with full military systems instead of stealth equipment. Lisa Chong plotted attack vectors with mathematical precision, while Danny Rodriguez armed weapons that could punch through coalition shields like they were made of paper. The technology gap between human and alien military hardware had grown enormous during the years of exile. Their first target was the Corvin mining facility on New Boston, where human survivors had been enslaved for decades after coalition forces declared them salvage from a dead world. Intelligence reports indicated that nearly 50,000 humans were still alive in the underground mining complexes, working in conditions that violated every civilized standard of prisoner treatment. Beth Johnson led the Liberation Ground Forces. From her assault transport, studying sensor data that showed the facility's defensive positions. The Corvins had built their operation around the assumption that slaves would never fight back, and that no outside force would challenge their claim to former human territory. Both assumptions were about to prove fatal. Gary Adams coordinated orbital support from his heavy cruiser, targeting the facility's shield generators and communication arrays with precision strikes that would disable defenses without collapsing the underground tunnels where human prisoners worked. The liberation had to be surgical, fast enough to prevent the Corvins from executing their slaves as a final act of spite. The attack began at dawn on New Boston's primary continent, with human fighters screaming down through the atmosphere to engage Corvin air defenses. The aliens had grown complacent during their years of unchallenged occupation, maintaining only minimal military forces on what they considered a routine industrial world. Beth's ground troops hit the facility's main entrance, while secondary teams infiltrated through ventilation systems and emergency exits that Corvin security had never bothered to properly secure. The assault was over in minutes, with most of the alien overseers surrendering rather than facing weapons they didn't understand wielded by soldiers they thought were extinct. The real shock came when the human prisoners emerged from the mining tunnels, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen for years. These were the children and grandchildren of colonists who had hidden in deep shelters when the devourers came, survivors who had been discovered decades later and sold into slavery by the same coalition that claimed to have evacuated all human populations. Jake Morrison watched the liberation through orbital sensors, seeing families reunited with relatives they thought were dead and workers walking free from industrial facilities that had been their prisons for most of their lives. The emotional impact was overwhelming, but it was also strategic. The galaxy needed to see that the Coalition's version of history was built on lies. The Corvin facility's computer systems contained detailed records of the slave operation, including communications with Coalition officials who had approved the use of human survivors as industrial labor. Gary Adams transmitted the data to hidden relay stations throughout galactic space, where human intelligence operatives would ensure it reached news networks and government databases. Meanwhile, Ryan Mitchell completed his deep cover mission on the Alteron capital world, uploading years of gathered evidence about Coalition war crimes to secure servers that would distribute the information across thousands of worlds simultaneously. The files included video recordings of Alteron officials discussing the profitable disposal of refugee populations and detailed financial records, showing how slave labor had funded the Republic's current prosperity. Maria Santos coordinated the intelligence release from her position in the Alteron refugee district, watching as news reports began appearing on local networks about human survivors and Coalition cover-ups. The reaction was immediate and explosive, with minor species throughout Alteron space demanding explanations about their own missing populations and questioning official histories of the Void War. The psychological impact spread through Coalition space like a shockwave. For 3 centuries, the major powers had told themselves they were heroes who had saved civilization from the devourer threat. Now evidence was emerging that they had been complicit in genocide, abandoning entire species to save resources and maintain their political positions. Beth Johnson walked through the liberated mining facility, documenting conditions that violated every standard of civilized treatment. The human prisoners had been worked in shifts that lasted 18 hours, fed on synthetic proteins that barely maintained life, and housed in dormitories that were little better than storage containers. The youngest survivors were in their 40s, born into slavery and never knowing freedom until today. The liberation of New Boston was broadcast across the Galactic Communication Network, showing images that contradicted 3 centuries of Coalition propaganda. These weren't ancient archaeological artifacts or historical documents that could be dismissed as forgeries. These were living humans, speaking in languages the galaxy remembered, telling stories of abandonment and survival that painted the Coalition as war criminals rather than heroes. Jake Morrison received updates from other liberation operations throughout former human space. The mining colony on Kepler 7 had been freed by Captain Lisa Chung's squadron, revealing another population of enslaved humans who had been discovered hiding in deep-sea installations after the official evacuation. The orbital facility above New Terra had surrendered without a fight when human ships appeared in system, with Alteron administrators fleeing rather than facing justice for decades of exploitation. Admiral Carter monitored the strategic situation from Titan Command, watching as Coalition military forces scrambled to respond to a threat they didn't understand. and major powers were demanding explanations from each other, suspecting that human survivors might have been secretly supported by rival factions. The alliance that had held the galaxy together since the Void War was beginning to fracture under the weight of revealed crimes. The intelligence warfare campaign was achieving results beyond human expectations. Minor species throughout Coalition space were questioning their own histories, demanding to know what had happened to missing populations, and wondering if their own governments had been complicit in abandonment and exploitation. The careful balance of power that had maintained galactic stability was collapsing as trust eroded between former allies. Gary Adams reported successful orbital bombardment of the Corvin facility's industrial infrastructure, destroying mining equipment and processing plants that had been built with human slave labor. The economic impact would be significant, but the symbolic value was even greater. The galaxy was seeing that humanity could strike back effectively against the species that had betrayed them. Dr. Susan Lee examined the liberated human prisoners, documenting genetic markers that proved their ancestry traced directly to Earth's original colonial populations. The biological evidence would be impossible for Coalition scientists to dismiss or explain away, providing irrefutable proof that humans had survived in significant numbers. Despite official claims of total evacuation, the liberated humans were transported to hidden facilities in deep space, where they would be integrated into the underground civilization that had grown during 3 centuries of exile. Their testimonies were recorded and prepared for broadcast throughout galactic space, personal accounts of abandonment and survival that would reshape public understanding of Coalition history. Jake Morrison prepared his squadron for the jump to their next target, a Zephyrian research facility that had been experimenting on captured humans for decades. The liberation campaign was gaining momentum, with each successful operation revealing new evidence of Coalition crimes and inspiring resistance movements among oppressed species throughout the galaxy. The war for justice had begun, and humanity was winning the first battles through superior technology and careful preparation. But the real victory would come when the galaxy understood the full scope of Coalition betrayal and demanded accountability from the leaders who had built their power on the graves of abandoned species. The reckoning was accelerating toward a conclusion that would reshape galactic civilization forever. Kate Roberts stood in the war room aboard the human flagship Democracy, studying holographic displays that showed rebellion spreading across the Outer Rim like wildfire. The liberation of New Boston had triggered something the Coalition never expected. Their own oppressed populations were rising up, inspired by humanity's return from the dead, and emboldened by evidence of 3 centuries of systematic exploitation. Steve Harris led the Ghost division through the shadows of Coalition space, striking at targets that existed only in classified databases. His teams moved like smoke through regions the galaxy had forgotten, liberating prison colonies and research facilities, where minor species had been subjected to experiments that violated every principle of civilized conduct. Each successful operation revealed new layers of Coalition corruption. The Dramari homeworld had declared independence from Zephyrian rule after human intelligence operatives leaked evidence that Coalition forces had sold Dramari prisoners to illegal research programs. The Nexian resistance had seized control of 3 star systems from the Halteron Republic, using weapons and tactics provided by human military advisors who remembered what it meant to fight for survival against impossible odds. Rachel Murphy coordinated an intelligence warfare campaign from her hidden base in the asteroid belt, managing networks of agents and sympathizers who had spent decades infiltrating Coalition governments. The evidence they had gathered painted a picture of systematic genocide disguised as humanitarian intervention, with the major powers profiting from the destruction of entire civilizations. Lisa Chong commanded her own squadron now, leading strikes against Zephyrian military installations that had been built on the graves of human colonies. Her navigation expertise had become legendary among human forces, finding paths through hyperspace that allowed surprise attacks deep in enemy territory. The Zephyrians were discovering that their carefully planned defensive positions meant nothing against an enemy that could appear anywhere. Paul Turner managed communications intercepts from his electronic warfare ship, listening to coalition officials panic as their version of history collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. Internal messages between government ministers revealed the depth of their crimes and the extent of their cover-up operations. Every intercepted communication became another weapon in humanity's arsenal of justice. Jennifer Clark worked in field hospitals throughout the liberation zones, treating survivors who had endured decades of slavery and experimentation. Her medical reports documented systematic abuse that had continued long after the coalition claimed to have completed humanitarian evacuations. The evidence was undeniable and damning, providing legal justification for everything humanity was doing. The coalition's propaganda machine was failing catastrophically. Minister Vel Tar of the Zephyrian Empire had attempted to portray humans as terrorists and aggressors, but leaked documents showed his own government discussing the profitable disposal of human populations. The Alteron Republic's claims of humanitarian intervention were destroyed by recordings of officials selling refugee populations to industrial consortiums. Coalition military forces were spread thin across dozens of worlds, where rebellion had broken out among species they thought were permanently subjugated. The Corvin Syndicate was facing revolt from 3 different slave populations simultaneously, with human advisors providing tactical support and advanced weapons to resistance fighters who had learned to hate their oppressors. Steve Harris led his Ghost Division against a classified research facility hidden in the dead zone between galactic sectors, where coalition scientists had been conducting illegal experiments on captured humans for 50 years. The facility's existence was denied by all 3 major powers, but human intelligence had located it through painstaking analysis of supply shipments and personnel transfers. The assault was swift and surgical, with ghost teams infiltrating through ventilation systems and emergency exits that hadn't been properly secured. Coalition security forces found themselves fighting enemies who moved like shadows and struck with weapons that ignored their defensive systems. The battle was over before the facility's commanders could activate their self-destruct systems. Kate Roberts received reports from the liberation operation, including video evidence of experiments that violated every standard of civilized conduct. Coalition scientists had been studying human physiology and psychology, testing the limits of endurance, and attempting to understand what made humanity so difficult to completely eliminate. The research data would be broadcast throughout galactic space as evidence of war crimes. Rachel Murphy's intelligence networks were reporting massive defections from coalition military units as evidence of government corruption spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had believed they were serving noble causes were discovering that their leaders had built careers on genocide and exploitation. Entire fleets were switching sides or refusing orders to fire on liberation forces. The Nexian exile government had been restored to power on their homeworld, with human military support, ending 70 years of Alteron occupation. Commander Zix High led Nexian forces in the liberation of labor camps throughout their former territory, finding populations that had been declared extinct by coalition historians, but had actually been enslaved in industrial facilities. Paul Turner intercepted communications from the Coalition Council discussing emergency measures to contain the spreading rebellion. The major powers were considering extreme options, including the use of planet-killing weapons against worlds that had declared independence. The desperation in their voices was evident as their carefully constructed empire of lies collapsed. Around them, Jennifer Clark documented the liberation of the research facility, interviewing human survivors who had been subjected to decades of medical experimentation. Their testimonies were recorded and prepared for broadcast throughout galactic space. Personal accounts that would demonstrate the full scope of Coalition crimes against humanity and other species. The psychological impact of the revelations was spreading beyond military and political targets. Coalition populations were demanding explanations from their governments about the true history of the void, war, and the fate of species that had supposedly been evacuated to safety. Public opinion was turning against leaders who had presented themselves as heroes while committing genocide. Kate Roberts planned the next phase of the Liberation Campaign, targeting the most heavily defended Coalition strongholds, where evidence of the worst crimes was likely hidden. The Zephyrian capital world contained archives that documented the entire conspiracy, while the Alteron military headquarters held records of slave operations throughout their territory. Steve Harris prepared his Ghost Division for deep penetration, raids against these ultimate targets, knowing that the Coalition would defend them with everything they had. The battles would be fierce and costly, but the intelligence value of the archives they contained would justify any price in human lives. Lisa Chang plotted hyperspace routes that would allow simultaneous attacks against all three Coalition capitals. Coordinated strikes that would prevent the major powers from supporting each other or destroying evidence before it could be captured. The navigation challenges were enormous, but her expertise had grown during years of combat operations in hostile territory. The rebellion was reaching critical mass throughout Coalition space, with minor species joining the Free Worlds Alliance and providing bases and resources for human military operations. The galaxy was discovering that the Coalition's version of history had been a carefully constructed lie designed to hide centuries of exploitation and genocide. Rachel Murphy's agents reported that Coalition intelligence services were incomplete, disarray, with officers defecting or refusing orders to suppress evidence of government crimes. The information warfare campaign had succeeded beyond human expectations, turning the Coalition's own bureaucracy against their leadership and exposing the full scope of their war crimes. The war was entering its final phase, with human forces preparing for direct assault against the Coalition capitals and the liberation of the most heavily guarded secrets. The galaxy would soon learn the complete truth about what had happened during the Void War and the 3 centuries of cover-up. That followed justice that was 300 years overdue but inevitable. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the bridge of the resurrection as the combined fleet of the Free Worlds Alliance dropped out of hyperspace around Nexus Prime, the Coalition's last stronghold. Beside her stood representatives of every species the Coalition had abandoned: Nexian Commander Zixhai, Dramari General Mordock, and dozens of others whose worlds had been sacrificed for political convenience 3 centuries ago. The battle for Nexus Prime began not with weapons fire, but with mass defections from Coalition forces who had learned the truth about their government's war crimes. Entire squadrons of Zephyrian ships switched sides rather than defend leaders who had built their careers on genocide. Alteron fleet commanders refused orders to fire on Liberation forces, knowing that their own families had been lied to for generations. Jake Morrison led the final assault through the Coalition's defensive lines, his squadron supported by vessels from a dozen species that had been declared extinct by official histories. The technological superiority that humanity had developed during 3 centuries of exile proved decisive, with human weapons and shields outclassing Coalition military hardware by orders of magnitude. The Coalition's last desperate gambit was an attempt to destroy their own archives rather than face accountability for their crimes. Rachel Murphy's intelligence operatives had anticipated this move, infiltrating the government complexes on Nexus Prime and securing the evidence that would reshape galactic understanding of recent history. Lisa Chang navigated the assault fleet through defensive minefields that had been designed to protect Coalition leadership from external threats. Her expertise allowed human forces to reach the planet's surface intact, where ground troops led by Steve Harris and his Ghost Division began the systematic capture of government officials who had spent centuries hiding behind lies and propaganda. Archives contained 300 years of classified documents that revealed the full scope of coalition crimes. Paul Turner worked with Zen archaeologists and legal experts to catalog evidence that proved the major powers had known about the Devourer threat months in advance, but chose to sacrifice expendable species rather than risk their own populations. Jennifer Clark established field hospitals for coalition personnel who surrendered rather than face justice through violence. The medical facilities also treated liberated prisoners from secret facilities throughout Nexus Prime, humans and aliens who had been subjected to illegal experimentation and slave labor for decades. The most damning evidence came from personal communications between coalition leaders during the Void War, messages that showed their deliberate decision to abandon human worlds and prevent evacuation ships from reaching endangered colonies. Minister Valtara's own files contained orders to sell human settlement locations to the Devourers in exchange for safe passage through infected space. Kate Roberts coordinated the occupation of coalition military installations, ensuring that weapons of mass destruction couldn't be used as final acts of spite against liberated populations. Her forces discovered planet-killing devices that had been prepared for use against rebellious worlds, weapons that violated every treaty the Coalition had signed regarding civilized warfare. The psychological impact of defeat was complete when Coalition populations learned about their government's true history through broadcasts of the captured archives. Public demonstrations erupted throughout Zephyrian and Alteron space as citizens demanded accountability from leaders who had presented themselves as heroes while committing genocide. Steve Harris led the capture of the Coalition Council chambers, where the major powers' leadership had gathered for a final emergency session. The arrest of Minister Veltar, Chancellor Krundok, and Syndicate Prime Morval was broadcast live throughout galactic space, showing the galaxy that the architects of 3 centuries of oppression would finally face justice. Admiral Carter addressed the galaxy from the former Coalition Council chambers, flanked by representatives of every species that had been abandoned during the Void War. Her message was broadcast simultaneously across thousands of worlds, reaching populations that had been lied to for generations about their governments. Heroic actions during humanity's darkest hour. The evidence presented during the broadcast was overwhelming and undeniable. Video recordings of coalition officials discussing the profitable disposal of refugee populations, financial records showing how slave labor had funded their prosperity, and personal communications revealing their deliberate abandonment of allied species when survival became inconvenient. The Free Worlds Alliance was formally established in the same chambers where the Coalition Council had once decided which species deserved to live and which could be sacrificed for political advantage. The new government was built on principles of equality and mutual protection, with constitutional guarantees that no species would ever be abandoned again. Jake Morrison was present for the signing ceremony, representing humanity's return to galactic civilization after 3 centuries of exile. His presence symbolized not just survival but transformation, the evolution of a species that had been abandoned by its allies into something stronger and more principled than those who had betrayed them. The war crimes. Tribunals began immediately, with coalition leaders facing judgment from representatives of every species they had wronged. The legal proceedings were broadcast throughout galactic space, ensuring that future generations would understand the consequences of abandoning moral principles for political convenience. Rachel Murphy's intelligence networks were transformed into the Alliance's Information Security Service, dedicated to preventing future cover-ups and ensuring that historical truth could never again be suppressed by those in power. The lessons of the Void War would be preserved and taught to every generation. Lisa Chong was appointed as the Alliance's chief navigator, responsible for mapping new hyperspace routes that would connect liberated worlds and facilitate trade between species that had been isolated by coalition policies. Her expertise would help build a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than exploitation. The Memorial Congress was established on New Geneva Station, a massive space habitat built from the wreckage of coalition military vessels. The station's central hall contained the memorial wall, where the names of every world lost to coalition betrayal were carved in black stone, ensuring that the victims of political abandonment would never be forgotten. Paul Turner managed the galactic communication networks that connected alliance worlds, ensuring that information flowed freely between species and that no government could suppress evidence of wrongdoing. The transparent information systems prevented the kind of cover-ups that had allowed coalition crimes to continue for centuries. Jennifer Clark headed the Alliance Medical Service, coordinating healthcare for liberated populations and establishing treatment protocols for survivors of coalition labor camps and research facilities. Her work helped heal not just physical wounds, but the psychological trauma of species that had been abandoned by those they trusted. The transformation of galactic civilization was complete when the last coalition holdout worlds voted to join the Free Worlds Alliance rather than face economic isolation and political irrelevance. The galaxy had chosen justice over the comfortable lies that had allowed systematic oppression to continue for 3 centuries. Jake Morrison visited the memorial wall regularly, reading the names of human worlds that had been lost to coalition